So there's a phrase that I heard when I was in the seminary, has stayed with me ever since then, and I've heard it a couple of times over the years within the church community, and you listen to people, hear people speaking, and they'll often say this phrase, especially when it comes to discerning, doing God's will. And the phrase goes like this. It says, if you want to make God laugh, just tell him your plans. If you want to make God laugh, just tell him your plans. And he'll laugh and say, ha, 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 ha. Now you have no idea. And this came up a little bit last week as we were looking at St. Francis of Assisi, whose feast day we celebrated on Monday, the 4th, and how Francis's world was turned quite upside down. He came from this world of wealth. His father was a wealthy merchant, cloth merchant, and Francis had these aspirations to be a soldier in the army, fighting over the Umbrian countryside near Assisi. And all of that changed. Francis went off to war, and he was captured, and he came back feeling quite dejected that his plans did not work out. We talked about the statue that is in Assisi. It's Francis on his horse returning from this failure, this failed plan, and the statue shows Francis on his horse bent over in dejection. And I found it interesting. I was thinking about it over the week that the statue is pointing Francis toward the basilica where he's buried. Right, so it's like, even though Francis's plans failed, God had something in store for him. And on the plaque before the statue, there's this dialogue between Francis and God, where Francis says, what do you want me to do? And then the Lord responds and says, go back to your town and you will be told what you must do. Right, so when Francis realized that his own plans weren't really going to get him where he wanted to go, he had the courage, he had this sense to call out to God and say, well, okay, I'm finally ready. What do you want me to do? And God told him, rebuild my church. And Francis was obedient. He went back and he completed his mission. We looked at the story, The Rainbow Fish, for those of you who weren't here. This little book that I remember from my childhood about this beautiful fish covered in these beautiful scales, and some of the scales are shimmering, they shine, and he's the envy of all the other fish. They want to play with him and just be in his presence. And one day this little fish swims up to him and asks the rainbow fish for one of his scales that shines. And the rainbow fish just scoffs at him and says, get away from me. But ultimately he has this change of heart when he's confronted by this octopus that says, no, you have to give away your scales if you want to be happy. And so the rainbow fish goes through this change of heart, and at the end of the book, he gives away all of his scales, and all of the fish, they have one shining scale that they share together. Each one has one, including the rainbow fish, and they're all together. And so it speaks to us of this truth. Even though children's book tells us that our plans, what we think is important in life, what we want to grasp for and cling for, popularity, notoriety, possessions, pleasure, like Francis, like the rainbow fish, ultimately all of that kind of fades away. But God's will and God's plan is everlasting, and God has what's best in store for us if we just give him an open heart, and we ask, like that opening prayer said, to conform our will to his. And so I don't want you to think that I just read children's stories, but I want to share another children's story with you that came to mind about this idea of our plans not always going how we want them to, and yet seeing God's hand working through it. And the story is called The Three Trees. Has anybody ever heard that story before? The Three Trees? It's a good one. You might want to get it after. But it's about these three little trees that are growing on the top of a hill overlooking a city. And they're talking about what they want to be when they grow up. And the first little tree says, when I grow up, I want to be covered in gold. I want to be a treasure chest that's filled with the finest treasure. That's what I want to be. And the second tree, looking down the hill to the city where there's a little harbor, says, I want to be a great sailing ship. And I want to go through rough water. I want to conquer the waves and the storms, and I want to carry prominent men and women within me, kings and lords. I want to be this great ship. And the third tree says, I want to just stay on the hill and grow and be big and tall and beautiful, so that when people look up at me, they are reminded of God. So the three trees grew. They grew and grew over the years, and one day 3 lumberjacks came and they started to cut down the trees. And the first tree was very excited. He was thinking, oh, this is my time. I'm going to become that treasure chest that I always wanted to be. And indeed, this lumberjack cut the tree down and took him into a carpenter's shop. But instead of being made into a beautiful treasure chest, he was made into a feeding trough for animals. And instead of being filled with treasure and covered in gold, it was filled with hay and sawdust. And the second tree that wanted to be this massive sailing ship was quite excited when he was taken to the shipyard. But instead of being made into this magnificent ship, he was turned into just a little dinghy, a little boat, a little sailboat. And lastly, the third tree was quite upset, just wanted to stay up there and grow. But that lumberjack came and cut her down. And to her dismay, she ended up just being made into beams for some later project and just kind of sat in the lumberyard. And so some years went by, and the first tree that had been made into a feeding trough for animals was in the stable one cold and dark night when this light began to shine into the barn, covered the feeding trough in this brilliant light, when this little humble couple came in and they placed their baby into the feeding trough. Another word for feeding trough is a manger. And seeing this brilliant light and these angels singing, the tree that had become the feeding trough realized that at last it was holding the treasure that it always wanted to be holding. Some years went by, and this little boat that wanted to become a great ship was seated on the shore of the lake where it had been being used, and it was filled with dead fish and nets. When this man came and got into the boat with the boat's owners, and they set out onto the sea, and the storm came. And the little boat was thinking, I'm in the storm. I don't know if I'll be able to overcome these waves. But the man spoke up and said, peace, be still. And the storm was calmed. And the little boat that had wanted to become a ship realized that finally it was carrying the King of Kings. And this last tree that had been turned into beams was just sitting there in the lumber yard when one day it was picked up and it was led through the streets, and to this tree's sadness, there were a bunch of people on the left and the right just screaming and being incredibly mean to this person who was carrying this beam. They're spitting at him and making fun of him. And this person carrying this beam brought it up to the top of the hill, and this tree was so shocked when they nailed the man to the beam. And so they took him down from the beam and left the beam up there on the hill. And a couple of days later, this tree learned that the man who had been nailed to her wood had risen from the dead. And she realized now, yes, when anybody looks up at me, they will be reminded of God. So you see that the plans of these 3 trees didn't turn out the way that they wanted. And yet God was there to use them for something that was quite remarkable. That's a lesson to all of us when sometimes our plans don't go the way that we want them to. And that was what happened to James and John, isn't it? James and John wanted to sit at Jesus' right when he came, his right and his left when he came in glory. They wanted the notoriety, they wanted the power, they wanted the prestige. And Jesus said, well, I'm going to take your plan and I'm going to flip it around a little bit. And ultimately, these guys, as I said in the beginning, all 12 of them wanted to do what James and John did. They said that they became indignant at them, the other 10, because they were really thinking the same thing. And all of them came to realize over time that the way of Jesus and following him and serving the way that he served was going to be the way that gave them the most fulfillment in life. They didn't get it right away, and we often don't get it right away, but that's okay. Because the story of the apostles gives us hope that ultimately we can get it because they got it as well. And I want to read you something, and we'll talk about it after. This is what somebody said. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers. Whoever does not love remains in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life remaining in him. The way we came to know love was that he laid down his life for us, so we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. You know who said that? John. The one in the gospel who was so concerned about himself and his brother, about being popular, about being having the most power, he went on to say, we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers, just like Jesus laid down his life for us. This is the way. This is the way that's going to give our hearts peace, that's going to give us satisfaction. And sometimes that means letting go of our own wills and our own plans. And from personal experience, I kind of know what this is like. I want to share a story with you about my own life. When I was just finishing up high school, I would say I didn't even have a plan. Right? But I wanted to have fun. I wanted to have a good time. So it was a very kind of self-centered plan. When one day I was meeting with my priest, his name was Father Paul Minahan. I think I've shared this story with the community before. I'm not sure if everyone's heard it. But I was meeting with him because I was kind of, my plan was not really going in a good direction. And so my parents wanted me to speak to the priest. And me and Father Paul Minahan met, and he said, there's something I would like you to do. There's a man, his name is Tim, he's a parishioner, and he sent me a letter, and I want you to help him out. So Tim was in his 40s, and he was a Moraga native, and he was a Cal grad. He was living at home, and he was a paraplegic, which means he was in a wheelchair. He could not use his legs. Because when he was in his 20s or so, he was on a Spanish immersion trip, and he was at the beach swimming in the water, and the wave took him and rolled him into the shore, and he broke his neck. And so from that time on, he was in a wheelchair, and he could use his upper body minimally, but he still needed people to help him in the mornings and in the evenings to get out of bed. You had to lift him up and put him in the wheelchair, get him changed, get him into his clothes, change his catheter bag, rinse that out, help him brush his teeth. And so Father Paul Minahan, seeing my plan kind of taking me off course, said, I want you to help this gentleman. So I was about 18 years old, and I showed up at his house the very first night to get a introduction of what I was going to be doing, and I thought, what the heck is going on here? I had never done anything like that. It was like being a nurse. And so over time, I began to go more frequently, one night a week, a couple nights a week. And it turned out that Tim became one of my closest friends. And I would say that on my path to entering the priesthood, my encounter with Tim was probably the most formative, important experience I had. And probably one of the most important experiences to myself in my entire life. Because in that moment, it was my first encounter with what it meant to serve, what it meant to truly follow Jesus Christ, to put my own will aside and to put somebody else first. And you know, the ironic thing about serving other people, about putting them first, about putting our will aside, is that when we serve them, we are the ones who are served. I was served much more by Tim and his humility and his joy and his grace than he was served by me, getting him in and out of bed one night a week. And that's what St. Francis of Assisi said. Right? He said, it is in giving that we receive. And that's what the great saints teach us. When really, all they're doing is just imitating Jesus Christ, who said, I did not come to be served, but to serve, and to lay down my life for many.